Okay, so thanks everyone for coming here on a Friday night. My name is Charlie Ontiveros, and today I'm going to be doing a presentation on multi-page applications versus single-page applications. And I'm going to be I have some examples that I kind of want to show you so you can kind of get an understanding of what the differences are between the two. And I'll also be kind of covering some of the pros and cons of each of these different approaches to building applications. So first, I kind of want to talk about a brief history of the multi-page apps and kind of where they came from. So the web browser was born in 1990. There was this guy, and that's the guy up there. His name is Tim Berners-Lee, and he was a scientist working at the CERN labs, and he wanted to come up with a new technology that would allow information to be shared rapidly and easily with some of his fellow scientists. So he kind of went and he invented, the world's first web browser and also the world's first website. And what's really cool about this is that you can actually go and visit the application that this guy built. And let's go ahead and just take a quick look at that. And this is pretty much it. This is the world's first browser and the world's first website that this guy built. And there's probably some things that are recognizable in it. For example, the links. Like if you double click on things, you can see that it kind of goes and it opens up more web pages, and you can kind of keep on clicking and it'll open up additional things. So that's kind of cool. One thing that I do want to mention is that back in 1990, JavaScript and CSS still had not been invented. Although HTML was around. So that's why when you look at the documents, there is a little bit of structure to it. And that's because HTML was around and the browser was kind of smart enough to at least add a little bit of formatting to the documents that people could browse. So how does a multi-page app actually work? So at the most basic level, you essentially have a browser, you have a server, and then somewhere on that server, there are different HTML web pages. So the browser will make a request to the server. The server will kind of read the URL, and then it'll go and grab that file and then return it back to the browser. And then the browser will go ahead and display that to the end user. And I've built a small Node.js application to kind of demonstrate how this works in practice. So here it is, simple MPA sites. Okay, so what I have here is I'm using Node with Express. And it's very simple. It's only a few lines of code, but let's go ahead and just quickly run through it. So here I'm importing Express. And here I'm defining the port. And then in this line, I'm essentially running a command called express.static, which what it does is it tells the server and it says, hey, you see this public folder that's right here? Make everything inside of this folder accessible to the internet, to the web browser. And then at the very end, I basically just say app.listen, which starts the web server. So let's go ahead and start it. And let's go ahead and visit it. Localhost 3000. And this is a very simple web page that I kind of just put together. And what's going on here is whenever I access this URL, the server is grabbing that index.html page and returning it back to the browser. And whenever I click on a link to navigate to a different page, the browser will send another request to the server. And in this case, the server is returning the about.html web page back to the browser. So it's pretty straightforward. This is very, very basic, right? And here are the files. Here's my HTML file, and then here's my index file. So at the most basic level, that's all you really need to get a website up and running. So technology always advances. It always gets a little bit more complicated as time goes on. It's just kind of the nature of the beast. So that kind of advanced, and the reason why it advanced was because JavaScript was invented in 1995. You also had CSS being invented in 1997. So that kind of allowed web developers to develop slightly more complex web applications. So that added an additional layer to all the requests, whereas before the server was just returning like a static HTML file. Now you kind of had this additional layer to where inside of an HTML file, you can have a link to, say, a JavaScript file or a CSS file. So what happens there is as soon as the browser gets that HTML web page, it'll see that there are requests for a JavaScript and CSS file. And then the browser will go ahead and it'll make additional requests for those JavaScript files or the CSS files or whatever other stuff's being requested in that HTML web page. And I have another simple Node.js app here that I've built to kind of demonstrate that. Let's see. And I'm actually going to take the same application that I built, and I'm just going to uncomment this out. So what this is a request for Bootstrap, which I'm pretty sure you guys are kind of familiar with. So let's go ahead and let me reload this first of all, because there we go, I'm not using NodeMon. And if I go back to the home page, you'll see that the font has all of a sudden changed. And also, if you look on the right-hand side, you'll see here that, you know, once the browser got the HTML web page, it saw that there was a request for a Bootstrap a CSS file, and then it sent a request to go and get that out. And then, of course, it applied the CSS to the file, to the web page, I mean. Let's see here. Okay, but things still got more complicated. So I'm going to go ahead and show you guys kind of like a more complex model of how a multi-page architecture works. And something that kind of really comes to mind is stuff like WordPress. So as websites got bigger, it didn't really make sense to have like a folder with all your individual web pages, because you may start building a website that has hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of web pages. So it doesn't make any sense to have individual files. So that led to kind of like connecting web servers with databases to where a lot of your content is now stored on a database. And the server application is actually more complex. It's not making requests to the database to fetch information and all that. The other thing that I kind of wanted to point out here was templating languages, stuff like Handlebars and Mustache. And what a templating language does is it essentially allows you to define an HTML file, and you can put placeholders in that HTML file that will then be populated with other pieces of HTML. So let's go ahead and I'm going to show you an example, so it will kind of make more sense once I show you guys. Okay, so here I have an example of a more complex multi-page app. It's still pretty simple, but there's more going on here. So I'm just going to quickly run through this and explain what's going on. So I've installed something called Nunjux. So Nunjux, it's a templating engine, and I'm basically just configuring some things here. And what's happening here is that I've also taken like the head part of the HTML, and I've kind of broken it out into a component. So if we take a look at index.html, you'll see now that instead of having the head there, we have something that looks like this. So the way that this works is that when a user makes a request to this page, Nunjux will load this HTML file, but then it'll see that, hey, there's actually something here pointing to another piece of HTML. So it'll go to this component, grab that, and as you can see, it's HTML, and it'll essentially put that in there, put that into the index page before it sends the HTML web page back to the browser. And let's go ahead and see that in action. So there we have, also, the other thing that I also made a component was a navbar. So there's a navbar on there. And the cool thing about this approach is that if I go to a different page, it'll have the same navbar. And now because stuff has been broken out into different components, I now have just one place where I need to make modifications to. Because one thing that I wanted to point out as well was, with the old stuff, check this out. I kind of forgot to add the bootstrap CSS to this other file. So you end up with bugs like this where, oh, I kind of forgot to copy over some of the changes that I made to this file. So by breaking things up into components, it kind of solves some of those issues that otherwise may occur. The other thing that I wanted to point out here was, it says here that my name is Bobby, and this is actually not hard-coded into the HTML web page, and that's because a templating engine also allows you to kind of make a website more dynamic. And the way that works is, if we take a look at the application here, so we have the About page, and I'm essentially grabbing the About page, but I'm also passing in this variable named Bobby. So if I were to update this to something else, then that change would be reflected on our web page. And now it says Charlie. So although this is kind of like a very trivial example of how this this works, in reality, you can really kind of add some complicated logic to make the application more dynamic and make web pages kind of dynamic as opposed to being completely like static and hard coded. And there are a lot of different technologies for this. The one that really comes to mind again is WordPress, but there's really a lot of stuff like Ruby, Python, especially PHP, C#. All that stuff kind of allows you to build applications in that kind of manner. Okay, so now I guess to talk about some of the pros and cons, because like everything in life, there's always good things and bad things about stuff. So one of the good things about multi-page apps are the ease of development. So if you guys remember, like the first thing that I showed you is like 6 lines of code, and then I can just start adding I could create a folder and then just start adding HTML pages. So it's like super easy and super simple and straightforward to get started with a multi-page app. So that's kind of one of the pros. The other pro here is that multi-page apps have been around for a very long time. I mean, since 1990, which is what, 29 years. So what that means is that it's given our industry a lot of time to kind of figure out what the best practices are in terms of building an application out. So if you have questions about like, oh, like how should I architect this multi-page app? Like what's the best way of doing it? Chances are that there are, or it's already a good answer, or at least like multiple really good answers to your question. So that's pretty nice. It kind of helps. It might help you avoid like going down the wrong path when building out an MPA. The other pro here is that a multi-page app can really be as large as you want it to be. It can be as simple as just a few pages, or you can have tens of thousands. You can even have millions of web pages. Like if you think of a website like Amazon, for example, right? They have so many products, and it's just, I'm pretty sure they have millions of pages. And as long as you have the infrastructure set up, kind of like the back end all figured out, a multi-page app can be as large as you want it to be. There's no limit to it. One of the other pros that I wanted to touch on was search engine optimization, or SEO. How many of you guys like understand how SEO kind of works at a just basic level? Raise your hand. Okay. All right, so I saw a few hands, but I also see some other people that didn't raise their hands, and that's okay. So I'll just go ahead and give a very quick overview of how search engine works. So search engines have these applications called web crawlers, and what they do is they'll go and they visit a particular website, and they will request the HTML web page. And once they get it back, obviously the HTML web page has text on it, so it'll parse that out. In that HTML page, there's also links to other pages. So the web crawler is smart enough to grab those links, and it starts navigating through your website. And it starts going through your entire site and grabbing all the HTML files. And then from that, it starts like, parsing everything. And that's kind of how you get your ranking, right, for SEO. So that's kind of how that works. Now let's go ahead and talk about some of the cons of a multi-page app. So one of the cons here is latency. Because you're starting to tack on resources to an HTML web page, it takes some time for the browser to get that. And in addition to that, those resources may also have additional requests for other resources. And a lot of times the browser it can't really jump ahead. It has to wait until it gets something before it does something else. So that can kind of increase some latency in the application. And let's go ahead and just take a quick look. I wanted to show you a website real quick, so you can kind of see an understanding of, get an understanding of what I'm referring to. So one thing that I kind of want everyone to pay attention to, I guess, is this filter thing at the top here, where it kind of has a bunch of time. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to visit a multi-page app, Ars Technica. And it's still kind of going. It's still kind of going. All right. Depending on how fast your internet connection is, it may take a long time or not. In this particular case, it took about 15 seconds for the web page to finish loading. And also, if we take a look at some of the resources here at the very top, let's see, where is it at? Oh, here we go. You can kind of see that some requests kind of start off here, but I guess it might be a little bit hard to see from there. It might be a little bit easier to see the waterfall. So as you can see, some of the requests don't really start until the other requests prior to it have finished. So that's kind of what I mean by latency. The other con here, and perhaps this is like the biggest problem with a multi-page app, is that it tightly couples the front end and the back end. So your application is doing a lot of work in a multi-page app. It's not only grabbing information from different sources, but it's also like adding logic on top of that. And then it's also building the HTML web page that is going to get sent back to the user, to the browser. And I guess the best example of that is kind of WordPress. I kind of wanted to show you this so you can kind of see what I'm talking about when I say that the front end and the back end are kind of one in a multi-page app. Let's see here. So this is kind of what a WordPress install looks like. You see there's a ton of different PHP files here. And it's a good thing because it kind of separated different functionality into its own components, so that's good. But I kind of wanted to show you this. Let's take a closer look at this WP login page. So as we can see here, it looks like it's just a bunch of code, right? But this is actually, the end result of this is actually a piece of HTML. And this particular PHP file is responsible for the user page. So it handles authentication, registering, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So obviously it looks like a bunch of PHP, but if we take a closer look, we actually see that there's HTML here. So that's where it starts. Then we have the title, some meta, and if we keep on going, we kind of have the beginning of the body, and then some other stuff here. I don't know about you guys, but when I take a look at this, it's very hard for me to understand where the HTML begins and where the logic ends. Everything is just kind of like mashed together. So if you guys can imagine, having so much logic like this in the HTML template has a couple of issues. First of all, what happens when there's a bug in this logic and it like kind of craps out? That means it could end up like breaking that entire component or that page. The other thing that I kind of find difficult is, well, what if I want to modify the way that the page looks, right? I want to add some divs or do some modifications. There's a bunch of PHP code here, so it's like I don't even know how to like begin modifying, like where do I even add the HTML? So I just kind of want to show you guys what I mean when I say that, when a multi-page app, the front end and the back end can be really coupled together. Okay, so onto single-page applications. Unlike multi-page applications where there's like you can kind of go back and point at 1990 and say, hey, that's when they were born. With the single-page applications, there isn't really kind of a single point in time that you can point back and say that's when they were born. It really kind of evolved, and it evolved because new technologies started to come out. You had things like AJAX, which are asynchronous JavaScript requests. You also had more JavaScript kind of develop more capabilities, and also the browser allowed developers to take advantage of even more stuff than before. Furthermore, you also had tools like jQuery and Dojo. So the evolution kind of happened like this. At the very beginning, you had multi-page apps, and all you could get back is a static HTML web page. So then after some time, that kind of evolved to where you kind of had some of these technologies like jQuery, and now you had a scenario where you can start to add JavaScript to your HTML web pages, and you can start like modifying certain parts of the UI based off of what the user was doing, right? Like, how many of you guys have used jQuery? I'm pretty sure a lot of people are pretty familiar. But anyway, jQuery is a framework that it allows you to change pieces of an HTML web page without necessarily having to send another request to the server. So it's kind of like the middle ground, and then that kind of paved the way to what we have now with single page applications, to where everything is done through JavaScript. And let's go ahead and kind of get into how a single page app works. So a single page app gets its name because the server only returns one HTML web page. After that, it's the JavaScript that dynamically changes the UI and it kind of generates the views. One kind of cool thing is that you can also include CSS in JavaScript. You can bundle it together. And then another defining feature of a single page app is that when it's talking to the server, it typically sends just like a AJAX request, and it gets back a response, typically like JSON format. And then after that, the browser kind of does whatever it needs to do with that information. Whereas with the multi-page application, if you made a request to the server would often return back an entirely new HTML web page. So it's more, so the single page app is more efficient because it allows you to send smaller pieces of information to get, you know, stuff going. And that's just kind of like a very quick diagram of how it works. So let's go ahead and look at a quick sample here. And this is an application that I built using Vue like almost a year ago. So I'm going to go ahead and load that up. And here we can see that the browser got back this document page from the server. And right after it got the page from the server, of course, there's a link to grab the JavaScript file. So it sent another request to get that JavaScript file. And in this case, this build.js file is the entire application. So if I want to navigate to a different page and if I click on login, what's happening here is that the JavaScript that's running underneath is actually grabbing that request and is updating the entire page. So there is no request going to the server. The same thing for the sign up page. If I click on that, again, no request gets sent out. If I try to log in, then that will send a request to the server. And again, we'll kind of see that there are some error messages because, well, I didn't add any, these are required fields and I didn't add anything on there. So the server is basically telling me, hey, these are required fields. So that's kind of how high-level view of how single-page applications work. So now onto the pros and the cons of a single-page app. The biggest pro for the single-page application is that it kind of forces the separation of the front end and the back end. So the way it typically works with a single page application is your backend becomes an interface to a database, and it normally exposes that interface through like a REST API. So your application that's running in the browser, it essentially communicates to the server by sending requests to the API, and then that causes updates, and you can kind of modify data. But one of the things that I wanted to note here is that the server is no longer sending back HTML to the browser. It's just sending JSON for the most part. The other cool thing about separating those two is that, let's just say that someone here builds a very popular single page application and it blows up. And then you want to develop a mobile app, like an iOS application or Android app. Because you have kind of separated the front end and the back end, it very easily allows you to like grab a team to build the mobile application, like the iOS app, and then you can have another team building the Android app, and then you can still continue working on your single page app. And because all of these things are kind of separated from each other, it kind of allows you gives you a lot of flexibility in working on things independently without worrying too much that a change in one thing is going to impact the other thing. So that's kind of like a huge difference between the MPA model, where everything was kind of just stuck together into one thing. The other pro here is UI responsiveness. again, because everything is happening on the browser and the browser does not have to send a request to the server, it results in a very quick UI. Like the changes are pretty much instantaneously. Another pro about single page apps are that it lets you have some offline capabilities. So for example, if you are working on something and if you lose internet connectivity, you can keep on working on that app. And then if it's smart enough, once you have internet connectivity again, it'll sync itself back up to the database. And that's kind of nice to have. Whereas with the multi-page app, if you try to navigate to another page and you don't have any internet connection, it just doesn't work. It gives you back an error and everything stops working. Having said that, even though these things sound pretty cool, there's always cons to everything. So one of the cons there is the initial load time. Because it's the JavaScript that is actually generating what the user is seeing on the browser, what that means is that the browser has to wait, the user has to wait as well until the browser can fetch the JavaScript file before anything happens on the screen. So if you have like a slow connection and a big JavaScript file to download, it can take a while before the user even sees anything. They might just get like a white page for a few seconds before anything happens, which can lead to kind of like a bad user experience. The other con about the single page app is complex tooling. And although there are tools that kind of make it easy to get started on building a single page app, like for example, React has Create React App and Vue has Vue CLI. And these tools allow you to very easily kind of like start developing a single page application. The truth is that underneath it all, there is a ton of configuration that's being hidden away from the user. And it's pretty complicated. So I kind of hope that whenever I'm working on these tools that I don't run into some sort of weird bug, because that means delving down into like this compilers and transpilers and bundlers and all sorts of different things. The other con about the single page apps are that it has terrible SEO. And again, the main reason for that is because web crawlers, when the search engines built them, they built them with the understanding that whenever they send a request to the server, they would get back an HTML web page and they could parse that HTML web page. But with a single page application, you only have one HTML web page, and then it's usually mostly empty. There's nothing on it because it's the JavaScript that's creating everything that you see. So web crawlers have not advanced and they have not been able to kind of develop ways to be able to handle the changes that are occurring to a page through JavaScript. So what that means is that for most search engines, I know that Google can kind of somewhat parse single page apps, but it's far from excellent. So because of that, that's kind of one of the cons of single page apps. The other con here is that the best practices are still in development. And we can kind of see that by taking just a look at the JavaScript environment, right? Like everything's changing. Like every 6 months, there's like a new framework and new things coming out and all sorts of different changes occurring. And again, the reason why that's happening is because the industry still hasn't really kind of agreed upon or narrowed down the set of like best practices or best ways of doing a single page app. So that's kind of one of the cons there. If you have questions about how to build certain things, you may not be able to get a great answer. You kind of just have to like do trial by error and just kind of figure it out amongst yourselves. Last but not least, single page apps have technology lock-in. So if we think about Angular and kind of what happened a few years ago, where I think the Angular team decided to update Angular, and then they essentially made so many updates that it kind of broke the old Angular, and then they stopped supporting the previous version of Angular. So what ended up happening there was that those developers were essentially stuck with two choices. They can either like maintain like the Angular framework themselves because no one else is going to do it, or they can choose to like migrate over to a new framework. But in that case, because your entire application is built using a single framework, that means rewriting your entire application in a new framework. So that can be really, really rough. If you have like a big application, that's a huge job, like trying to rewrite the entire app. So that's just something to watch out for when it comes to building stuff with using single page technologies like like React and Vue.js and Angular. And let's see here. I actually have a couple of examples to show for single page applications. So let's go ahead and cover those real quick. Let's see. So in this particular example, I'm using React to kind of rebuild the application that I built previously. Again, it's super simple, right? I have quote unquote two pages, the home page and the about page. And here what we have is, again, it's just regular HTML. And so what's going on here is because with a single page application, you kind of have to like redo the way that I guess page changes are handled on the front end. You normally have something called a router. And what the router does is it kind of listens to where, if you click on certain links, that's what kind of triggers the changes in the UI to a different page. So let's go ahead and take a quick look on how that actually looks like. And network page, reload that. So that's pretty much it. Again, it's very trivial, but that's kind of how building a web page using a single page application framework like React would work. In terms of the complexity that I was referring to earlier, I'll just go ahead and show you real quick what I'm talking about here. So developing the application seems pretty straightforward, right? You have a few different files that you use to build your application, but then once you actually are ready to deploy it to the cloud, Netlify or whatever service you want to, it kind of builds out some, I guess, files. And again, kind of looking at these files, I mean, all of this stuff is kind of unintelligible. Like I have no idea what's going on there. And then you kind of have just different types of JavaScript files here and CSS files. And if you take a look at them, they kind of look like nothing that we're kind of used to, or nothing that people can really read. And that's kind of what I mean by the complexity. The reason why it's like that is because there has had like some really smart people have had to like build out some really advanced technologies in order to be able to like develop, the ability to do everything to JavaScript on the browser. So there's a lot of complexity underneath it all. And this is kind of like an example of that I wanted to show you. Okay, so the next thing that I kind of wanted to talk about was next generation technologies, and that's kind of what you mentioned about multi-page apps. So there are these things called static site generators for single page applications, and what they kind of allow you to do is a static site generator is a technology that will grab a single page application, and it's smart enough to kind of navigate through the different pages, and then what it does is it kind of actually ends up generating different HTML pages based off that single page application. So it kind of allows you to, in other words, create this weird hybrid where you can take a single page app, pass it to the static site generator, it generates a bunch of like HTML files, and then when the user is navigating through that application, it kind of behaves a little bit like a multi-page app, but in the background, it's actually loading the application. So once it finishes loading the JavaScript, it actually becomes like a single page app. And that kind of helps. The main reason why this came about is this really helps with the issue of SEO. So if you guys recall earlier, the way web crawlers work is they're expecting back an HTML web page from the server. So with static site generators, it kind of solves that issue because it generates HTML files. So it gives something for the web crawlers to kind of access and give a website search engine ranking. I guess the good thing about this is like let's just say that you guys have spent a lot of time learning how to use like React or Vue, and now you kind of want to build a multi-page app, but you don't want to have to like relearn everything, just like build a multi-page application using a different technology like a templating language or other stuff. What's neat is that the static site generators basically let you use your existing skills to create a multi-page app or something similar to it. Having said that, I do want everyone to understand that it's still not, it does help with SEO, but there's still some issues with it. It's not going to be exactly like a multi-page app. So if you want ultimate SEO, I would still like recommend multi-page app. Yeah, yeah. So the last thing, that I want to talk about was kind of what some of the best users are. So for multi-page apps, again, blogs, e-commerce sites, news sites, and in general, any sites that have like low user interactivity, a multi-page app would be kind of like a good way to build these types of applications. For single-page applications, we're talking about sites that have high user interactivity. So we're talking about stuff like Slack, Facebook, Discord, Google Sheets, or anything else where the end user is going to be essentially clicking and doing a whole bunch of different operations with the application. That's where having a single-page app really kind of shines in that particular scenario. And I think that's pretty much it. If you guys, I guess, have any questions, you guys can kind of ask me after I end the presentation, or you guys want to, there's some information up there on my website and also my Twitter handle. So, so that's it.
So, Charlie, you probably got a few sites out there.
Yeah, a couple.
So, who do you use for hosting?
I've done a little bit of everything. So, I used to have WordPress. My website now actually migrated from WordPress to Netlify, and I actually use Gatsby JS. So I kind of rebuilt my site.
But when you deploy it, so the world can access it.
Mm-hmm.
With whom have you gone?
I actually wrote my own. I wrote my own. So I have, I have AWS.
Okay,
so I use EC2 instances, which are virtual machines.
You put it on EC2. Okay.
Yeah.
So AWS, is that, because I don't really use them because I haven't had time to get my site up, but I did pay them to host my site.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even remember her name, but they're one that probably that some have suggested. But with your experience with AWS, is it really easy to deploy?
Yeah, EC2, it's not easy. I mean, you kind of have to do everything yourself.
You still have to forward
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I suffered quite a bit because all the virtual machines on AWS, at least the cheap ones, they're all Linux. So you have to really know how to use Linux and configure Apache or Nginx and then set up proxies, and it can get kind of complicated.
Okay.
So unless you kind of like really like it, I would just recommend going with like something like Bluehost or rolling it on some other different types of providers that kind of make it easy for you to deploy your site.
There you go. That's what that's on it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I guess that's pretty much it.